Edward Monroe, a self-made billionaire, thought he had found peace. After years of working tirelessly in the city, he decided to move his family away from the chaos and settle in a grand estate surrounded by the deep, mysterious jungle. The peaceful isolation was perfect. He lived with his wife, Rebecca, and their son, Lucas. It seemed like the perfect life, a beautiful home, fresh air, and endless tranquility. But something was wrong. At first, it was subtle. Edward noticed that his son, Lucas, who had always been full of energy and joy, was changing. He began to withdraw from the world, staring off into the distance as if lost in thoughts no one could understand. His behavior became stranger. Sometimes, Lucas would speak to himself in whispers, as if conversing with someone who wasn't there. Edward didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was just the isolation of the jungle getting to him. But the changes kept coming. One evening, as the sun began to set, Edward saw something that made his blood run cold. He was sitting on the porch, sipping a drink, when he saw Lucas, in his usual silence, standing by the edge of the jungle. The boy was just staring at the thick trees ahead, his body stiff and unmoving. Edward felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't like Lucas to act this way. Curiosity gnawed at Edward, and he decided to follow his son to see what he was doing. Maybe he was just taking a walk, or maybe he was feeling the weight of their secluded life. But as he moved through the trees, Edward began to feel something unnatural. The usual sounds of the jungle, chirping insects, rustling leaves, the distant calls of animals, had stopped. It was so silent, it almost felt as though the jungle was holding its breath. As Edward followed Lucas deeper into the woods, the air grew thicker, heavier. The trees loomed like dark shadows, blocking out the little light that remained from the setting sun. Lucas kept walking, unaware that his father was behind him. His steps were slow, as if he were being drawn forward by an invisible force. Suddenly, Lucas stopped. Edward froze in his tracks. He could see his son standing in the middle of a small clearing, his head tilted slightly to the side, as though listening to something or someone that Edward couldn't hear. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. There was no one else in sight, no animals, no sounds. Just Lucas, standing still as if in a trance. "Lucas?" Edward called softly, stepping forward. "What are you doing?" His son didn't respond. Instead, Lucas began whispering. The words were in a language Edward didn't recognize, a strange, guttural tone that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. The ground beneath his feet seemed to vibrate slightly, a deep hum that seemed to echo all around him. Edward's heart raced. He took another step closer, but something held him back, an eerie presence, as though the jungle itself was warning him to stay away. And then, out of the corner of his eye, Edward saw something, a shadow moving between the trees. It was large, far too large to be an animal, and it moved silently, almost like it was gliding through the air. Edward's breath caught in his throat. The shadow disappeared as quickly as it had come, but the strange chanting from Lucas grew louder. The boy's eyes flickered, and then suddenly they changed. Edward gasped. Lucas's eyes glowed a fierce red. "Lucas!" Edward shouted, stepping forward, his voice trembling with fear. But Lucas didn't respond. Instead, he continued to chant, his voice now rising in pitch, the words twisted and foreign. Edward's mind raced. What was happening to his son? Was he possessed by something? Was this the jungle's curse? Edward didn't have time to think. Panic surged through him, and he grabbed his son's arm. "We're going home. Now." But Lucas jerked away with a terrifying strength, spinning around to face his father. His eyes were glowing brighter now, and his body was stiff, unnatural. He wasn't the boy Edward knew anymore. "Why? Are you trying to stop me, Father?" Lucas asked in a voice that didn't sound like his at all. It was cold, detached. "You don't understand. This is what I have to do." Edward's heart raced as fear twisted his gut. He could see the boy's form starting to distort, his body rising off the ground, floating a few inches into the air. His breath came in sharp gasps as he backed away from his son, who now looked more like a stranger than the boy he'd raised. Suddenly, there was a low, rumbling growl from behind him. Edward spun around, his eyes searching the darkness. The growl came again, louder this time, and the jungle seemed to close in around him. There was something else here, something ancient, something powerful. Edward turned back to Lucas, whose body was now completely suspended in the air. The red glow in his eyes intensified. A deep, sinister laugh escaped from his lips. "You can't stop this, Father," Lucas said, his voice echoing in the stillness of the jungle. "It's too late." Edward's heart pounded in his chest, and the world seemed to spin. He could feel a powerful force around him, crushing the very air from his lungs. Lucas's body twisted violently, as if being pulled by some unseen force, his limbs contorting in unnatural ways. "Lucas, please stop," Edward screamed, desperate. But the boy's form only grew more distorted, and the growl from the jungle grew louder. It wasn't just one growl now, it was multiple. Edward's heart raced as he realized they weren't alone. Suddenly, a dark figure stepped forward from the trees, a shadowy shape larger than any animal Edward had ever seen. Its eyes were glowing a menacing red, much like Lucas's. It loomed over them, the air around it thick with an oppressive, ancient power. "Get away from my son," Edward shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the eerie laughter that filled the air. The figure reached toward Edward with long, gnarled fingers, and just as it made contact with him, the ground beneath his feet seemed to shake violently. The jungle erupted into chaos. In a panic, Edward turned and ran, stumbling through the thick forest. He couldn't look back. He didn't want to know what was behind him. But as he broke through the trees and made it back to the house, he was met with an even worse sight. Inside, Lucas was standing in the doorway, his eyes still glowing, his body still floating inches above the ground. Before Edward could react, Lucas's figure jerked forward, attacking him with unnatural strength. The force sent him crashing into the wall, his body aching from the blow. Lucas stopped. Edward cried out, but it was no use. The boy was no longer the son he knew. Something far darker had taken control. Then, as Edward tried to fight back, the windows of the house slammed shut, trapping him inside. Desperate, he tried to break through, but the door wouldn't budge. It was locked. He turned, looking for another way out, but the shadows outside seemed to come alive. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, everything went silent. The air lightened, the oppressive weight lifting from his shoulders. Edward turned to look at Lucas, who had collapsed onto the floor, his body motionless. Was it over? But deep inside, Edward knew the jungle's curse was far from finished. The night seemed to stretch on forever. The once peaceful house, surrounded by the dense jungle, had now become a prison. Edward stood frozen in the living room, his breath shallow and his heart pounding in his chest. Lucas lay unconscious on the floor, his body still, but the eerie red glow in his eyes had faded. Despite the calm, Edward felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Something wasn't right. He couldn't understand what had just happened. The jungle, this cursed land, was taking hold of his son in ways he couldn't comprehend. He had heard the stories, of course. The locals always spoke of strange happenings in the woods, tales of spirits and dark forces that roamed the land. But Edward had never believed in such nonsense. Until now. He reached down to check on Lucas, his hand trembling as he touched his son's cool skin. Was he breathing? Was he alive? The boy's chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. But Edward couldn't shake the feeling that something inside him had changed. Suddenly, a low growl echoed from the distance. Edward snapped his head toward the window, his eyes searching the darkness outside. The growl was deep, animalistic, but it wasn't the sound of any animal he knew. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as the growl was joined by another, and then another, like a pack of unseen predators circling the house. Edward's mind raced. He had to get out, but the doors were still locked, the windows still sealed. It was as though the house itself was holding him captive. A shadow moved across the floor, a strange flicker of movement from the corner of his eye. Edward whipped his head around. He could see nothing, yet the presence, the weight of something dark and heavy, was pressing in on him from all sides. "Rebecca, where are you?" Edward yelled. Panic gripped him, and he ran through the house, trying every door and window, but all were locked. His voice echoed in the empty halls, but there was no answer. His wife, his family, they were all gone. Had they left? Or were they taken by whatever force now controlled Lucas? His thoughts were interrupted by a loud crash from outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, slow, deliberate. Someone or something was coming toward the house. Then he heard it, the voice of his son. "Lucas, Father," came the voice from the dark hallway. It was faint, but Edward could hear the unmistakable echo of something wrong, something inhuman in his son's voice. He turned toward the voice, his heart racing. "Lucas," he called out, his voice shaky. "Where are you?" Suddenly, Lucas appeared in the doorway, his eyes wide open, but still glowing a deep red. His body was floating again, suspended a few inches above the ground. But this time, there was something more terrifying about him. His skin was pale, his features gaunt, and his hair, once dark and healthy, hung in thin strands around his face. "Father," Lucas whispered again, this time with a twisted grin on his face. "I don't need you anymore." Edward's stomach turned. This wasn't his son. The boy in front of him was something else entirely, something that had taken hold of his son's body. And whatever it was powerful, dangerous, and full of malice. "Please, Lucas," Edward begged, stepping back. "Whatever this is, you have to fight it. You have to fight it before it's too late." But Lucas only laughed, a cruel, hollow sound that sent chills down Edward's spine. It wasn't just Lucas anymore. It was the curse of the jungle that had taken him, and it was spreading. Suddenly, the growls outside grew louder, closer, as if they were right at the door. Edward turned to look, but the shadows in the room began to twist and contort, as if something was trying to break through the walls. His mind raced. What was happening to his son? What was happening to this house? And then it hit him, the curse. The jungle had claimed his family, and now it was coming for him. "No!" Edward shouted. "I won't let you take him. I won't let you take any of us." In that moment, Lucas's eyes turned pitch black. The red glow disappeared, replaced by an unnatural, deep void. It was as though his son's soul had been swallowed by the darkness. Edward's heart nearly stopped as Lucas opened his mouth, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. The boy's body began to twitch, jerking in unnatural ways. His limbs bent and snapped like they were being controlled by some malevolent force. Edward's scream echoed through the house as he backed away, his mind barely able to process what was happening. His own flesh and blood was turning into something monstrous, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "Lucas, please," Edward cried, his voice breaking with desperation. But Lucas didn't respond. Instead, he floated toward his father, his arms outstretched as if to grab him. Edward stumbled backward, panic flooding his body. There was nowhere to run. The jungle outside was alive, and the house was now its prison. Suddenly, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the shadows in the room seemed to twist, forming into dark shapes. Edward's eyes widened as the shadows took form. Figures, dark and terrifying, with eyes that glowed like embers. These were not human, not animals, but something far darker, something ancient. Edward could barely breathe. The air grew thick, heavy with the weight of something oppressive, something that hung in the very walls. The figures were circling him now, their presence suffocating. He couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't escape. And then, just as quickly as it had all begun, Lucas let out a chilling scream. His body jerked violently, and his eyes turned back to their normal color, just as the shadows around them seemed to collapse into the air, vanishing without a trace. For a moment, everything was still. Edward rushed to his son's side, desperately shaking him. "Lucas? Lucas? Can you hear me?" But there was no response. Lucas was unconscious, his body limp in Edward's arms. As the first light of dawn began to break through the windows, the shadows lifted and the oppressive weight in the room faded. But something was still wrong. Lucas had fainted, and there was no explanation for the horrors they had just witnessed. Then, Edward turned to the window. The jungle outside was eerily quiet, and the sunlight seemed to make the trees look different, darker, as if they had seen something too terrifying to ever forget. And then he saw it, a figure standing in the distance, just beyond the trees. It was tall, cloaked in shadows, with glowing red eyes, a figure from the depths of the jungle, watching them. Edward's blood ran cold. The curse had not been broken. It had only just begun.